Good evening and welcome back to Royal Sleep Histories. Tonight, let the noise of the modern world drift quietly away. Settle beneath the covers, soften your breathing, and travel back through the misty centuries to Tudor England. Beyond the rain-darkened walls of ancient palaces, kings guarded their crowns, queens carried impossible hopes, and whispered secrets travelled through candlelit corridors. This was a dynasty born from a battlefield, shaped by fear, desire, faith, and the quiet tragedies of a single family. In tonight's story, we will wander through the shadowed world of the Tudors, from Henry VII's uncertain victory to the lonely final years of Elizabeth I. If you enjoy gentle history for sleep, royal histories, and the soft unfolding of forgotten lives, please consider subscribing and helping this video reach those who may need a quiet story tonight. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and let the distant bells of Tudor England begin to fade through the night. The morning after Bosworth arrived without celebration. A pale rain had fallen during the night, softening the churned earth of the field and settling into the prints left by men, horses, wheels, and broken weapons. Mist drifted low above the grass. It moved slowly between abandoned shields and torn banners, wrapping the dead in a thin, colourless veil. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a raven called once, then again. Its voice travelled through the damp air and faded into the silence. Henry Tudor stood at the edge of that wounded landscape and looked across the ground that had given him a kingdom. He was 28 years old. Until the previous day, he had been an exile with a precarious claim to the English crown. Now Richard III was dead, his body carried away from the battlefield, and Henry Tudor had been proclaimed king by men who had only recently been uncertain whether he would live to see the evening. The crown itself, according to later memory, had been found beneath a hawthorn bush. It was brought to Henry on the battlefield, wet with rain and mud, perhaps dented from the violence of the day. He accepted it not as a prize, but as a burden. For the crown of England had rarely been a peaceful object. It had passed through blood, suspicion, and broken promises. It had been worn by kings who had died in battle, by boys who had vanished behind the walls of the tower, and by men whose friends had become enemies before the candles burned low. Henry knew this better than most. He had grown up far from England, a child of danger and uncertainty. His father, Edmund Tudor, had died before Henry was born. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, was scarcely older than a girl when she gave birth to him. The Wars of the Roses had already divided the country into shifting loyalties, white roses and red, York and Lancaster, cousins and rivals. In those years, a family name could be both inheritance and accusation. Henry's claim through his mother was slender, complicated, and not entirely comfortable. The Beaufort line descended from John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, but it had begun outside marriage and later been legitimised with restrictions. There were stronger claims in England, or at least louder ones. But the old royal houses had exhausted themselves, princes had died, brothers had fought brothers, and every victory had created fresh reasons for revenge. For years Henry lived in Brittany, watched over but never entirely free. He learned the careful habits of a man who understands that a stranger's welcome can change with the wind. He waited while England changed kings. He waited while messages crossed the sea. He waited while those who wished to use him considered whether he was a useful hope or an inconvenient risk. Then, in August 1485, he sailed from France with a small army. He landed in Wales, where his family name still held some warmth, and began the slow march inland. There were no guarantees. Every road might have carried him towards a throne or towards a grave. At Bosworth, the decisive moment came not only from swords and armour, but from hesitation. Lord Stanley, whose loyalties had been uncertain, and whose wife, Margaret Beaufort, was Henry's mother, held his forces apart from the early fighting. Richard III watched him. Henry watched him too. Across the wet, open ground, men waited for powerful lords to reveal themselves. Then Richard made his final charge. He rode towards Henry, perhaps hoping to end the question of the crown with one fierce blow. The king's banner moved forward, steel flashed in the unsettled light. Yet Stanley's men came in at last, and Richard was cut down amid the press of battle. The old king died fighting, and the new one survived. But survival was not the same as security. Henry VII did not inherit an obedient kingdom. He inherited a country tired of war, but not necessarily healed by it. The Yorkist cause had not disappeared with Richard III's death. Many noble families had supported the House of York for generations. They had marriages, estates, private loyalties, and old injuries that could not be erased simply because a new king sat beneath a canopy of cloth of gold. So Henry moved with care. He dated his reign from the day before Bosworth, an act with a quiet, chilling purpose. Those who had fought for Richard could now be treated as rebels against their lawful king. Yet he did not unleash destruction upon all of them. He needed England to settle. He needed noblemen to believe that service to him could be safer than opposition. He offered pardons where pardons were useful, seized lands where seizure seemed necessary, and watched every household that had once held too much power. His marriage was equally careful. In January 1486, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. She was graceful, politically significant, and the living bridge between the houses that had torn England apart. Together, they represented a promise that Lancaster and York might be joined at last. The red rose and the white rose could become a single Tudor rose, neat and symmetrical in later portraits. But a marriage could not dissolve memory. In the quiet rooms of the palace, servants still knew which lord had fought on which side. Old men at table still remembered sons lost at Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury and Bosworth. Behind tapestries stirred by draughts, conversations lowered when strangers entered. In the city streets, rumour moved easily. A prince had been seen, a claimant had landed, a nobleman had changed allegiance, a messenger had travelled by night. Henry's court was not a place of constant shouting or visible terror. Its unease was often softer than that. It could be heard in the scratch of a clerk's quill long after midnight. It lay in sealed letters warmed by candle flames, in careful accounts of money paid to informers, in lists of names copied into ledgers. It appeared in the pause before a lord answered a question, and in the way a guard might glance twice at a visitor's face. Henry trusted systems because people could not always be trusted. He strengthened royal finances with relentless attention. In his chambers, accounts were kept with unusual care. Coins were counted, debts noted, obligations remembered. He used bonds and recognizances, legal promises backed by heavy financial penalties, to keep nobles obedient. A man who might dream of rebellion could be reminded that his lands, his income, and his family's future rested in the king's hands. To later generations, Henry acquired a reputation for miserliness, yet the cold arithmetic of his rule was also a language of fear. Money gave him independence from overmighty subjects. A full treasury meant soldiers could be paid, alliances could be made, and sudden threats could be met. In an England where a king's weakness invited challenge, thrift became a form of armour. Still, no ledger could entirely protect him from ghosts. The first great disturbance came in the form of a boy named Lambert Simnel. In 1487, only 2 years after Bosworth, Simnel was presented to the world as Edward, Earl of Warwick. The real Earl of Warwick was a young boy with Yorkist blood, the son of the Duke of Clarence and nephew to Edward IV and Richard III. He was confined in the Tower, but confinement did not prevent others from using his name. Simnel was not truly Warwick. He was a boy trained to resemble a prince, taught the gestures and speech expected of royalty. Behind him stood men with greater ambitions. John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, once considered a likely Yorkist heir, and Francis Lovell, a loyal supporter of Richard III. Across the Irish Sea, where Yorkist feeling remained strong, Simnel was crowned in Dublin as King Edward VI. The ceremony had all the outward shape of majesty. There were church bells, bright cloth, solemn words, and the sight of a boy raised above a crowd hungry for an alternative future. Yet beneath the ceremony lay something fragile and strange. A child wore a crown, while adult men whispered around him. His identity was borrowed. His destiny belonged to those who had placed him there. News of the coronation reached Henry's court like a draught under a door. The king answered with a display of calm authority. He brought the real Earl of Warwick out from the Tower and showed him publicly in London. The sight should have ended the deception. Here was the true boy, alive and unmistakably present. Yet rebellion does not always need belief. Sometimes it needs only dissatisfaction, old loyalties, and a cause around which men may gather. Simnel's supporters landed in England with German mercenaries and Irish soldiers. They marched through the north, hoping that Yorkist sympathisers would join them. Henry raised an army and travelled northwards to meet them. The two forces came together at Stokefield in June 1487, on a hot day, beneath a sky that offered no comfort. The fighting was fierce and close. Men fell in the long grass. Armour struck armour, arrows passed overhead with their brief, terrible whisper. By evening, the rebellion had been broken. Lincoln was dead. Lovell disappeared from history, perhaps drowned while fleeing, perhaps concealed for years in some forgotten place. The Battle of Stoke is sometimes called the last battle of the Wars of the Roses, though such endings are rarely as clean as historians would like them to be. Henry treated Lambert Simnel with a practicality that revealed much about him. The boy was spared. He was put to work in the royal kitchens, turning spits and serving in a household that must have seemed impossibly distant from the imagined throne of Dublin. Later, he became a falconer. There was mercy in this, perhaps, but there was also calculation. A dead pretender could become a martyr. A living pretender, reduced to a servant in the king's own household, became a quiet lesson in the futility of rebellion. For a while, the kingdom seemed to settle again. Then another shadow appeared. His name was Perkin Warbeck. Where Simnel had been an obvious fabrication for those willing to look closely, Warbeck was more unsettling. He was handsome, composed, and apparently educated in the manners of a court. In the early 1490s, he began to claim that he was Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who had disappeared in the Tower during the reign of Richard III. the mystery of the princes had never been resolved. They had been seen less and less, then not at all. Their fate had settled over England like an unspoken question. Some believed Richard III had ordered their deaths. Others doubted. Some hoped, quietly and irrationally, that one prince had escaped. Warbeck understood the power of that hope. He said he had survived. He said his brother Edward V had been murdered, but that he himself had been smuggled away and raised in secret. He spoke of fear, escape, foreign lands, and the long burden of hiding his true identity. To those who wanted to believe him, his story had the melancholy shape of a lost fairy tale, a prince in exile, a kingdom stolen, a return delayed by danger and grief. Foreign rulers received him with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Margaret of Burgundy, sister to Edward IV and Richard III, welcomed him and declared him to be her nephew. She had lived long enough to understand politics, and she had every reason to trouble Henry VII. James IV of Scotland gave Warbeck support and even arranged his marriage to the noblewoman Lady Catherine Gordon. At European courts, Warbeck could be dressed in velvet and treated with ceremony. He became a figure in a larger game of diplomacy, a useful threat in the hands of kings and duchesses who wished to pressure England. Each rumour of his arrival forced Henry to consider not only a boy claiming to be a prince, but ships, money, alliances, and foreign armies. At night, in royal chambers warmed by fires that could not quite defeat the damp, reports would have arrived. A messenger had crossed the channel. A vessel had been sighted. A lord had exchanged letters with Burgundy. A servant had heard a dangerous name spoken in a tavern. The king listened. He did not need every rumour to be true. He needed only to know that rumours could gather strength. Warbeck attempted to land in England in 1495, but found little support. He turned towards Scotland, where James IV made a brief raid into northern England in his name. The border country heard the movement of horses, the creak of leather harnesses, and the distant alarm of villages uncertain which flag would appear over the hill. Yet Warbeck's promised English supporters did not rise in sufficient number. The invasion faded back into the northern mist. Henry continued to endure. He negotiated, paid, threatened, and waited. His patience was one of his sharpest weapons. In 1497, Warbeck made his final serious attempt. He landed in Cornwall, a region already angry after a recent uprising against taxation. The Cornishmen had marched on London earlier that year, protesting a levy intended for war against Scotland. Their rebellion had been defeated, but resentment lingered among the hills and mining towns. Warbeck arrived with the hope that anger might become allegiance. For a brief time, thousands gathered around him. They marched eastward, carrying rough weapons and uncertain dreams. But the deeper they travelled, the clearer it became that a claim was not the same as a victory. Royal forces approached, support weakened. At Beaulieu Abbey in Hampshire, Warbeck surrendered. He was brought to London and displayed through the streets, a prince in name reduced to a prisoner under guard. The city watched from windows and doorways. Wheels rolled over wet cobblestones. Horses shifted in their harnesses. Faces leaned from upper rooms, curious and wary. Warbeck confessed that he was not Richard of York, but a Flemish man named Perkin Osbeck, or Warbeck. Whether every word of the confession was freely offered is difficult to know. Tudor governments understood the value of a public admission. For a time, Henry spared him. Warbeck was kept under supervision at court, where the king could observe the man who had disturbed his peace for so many years. But he escaped, or attempted to escape, and was soon confined in the Tower. There the story became darker. The real Earl of Warwick, whose name Lambert Simnel had once borrowed, had spent most of his life imprisoned. He was innocent of the ambitions that had swirled around him as a child. Yet in 1499 he and Warbeck were accused of plotting an escape and a new rebellion. Both were condemned. Warbeck was executed at Tyburn. Warwick was beheaded on Tower Hill. The sound of an axe in Tudor England was never merely the sound of punishment. It was a message sent outward through the kingdom. It said that the king remained awake. It said that old blood could still be dangerous. It said that a peaceful future might require terrible acts in the present. Warwick's death removed a Yorkist figurehead, but it also carried a sorrow that could not be entered into an account book. He had been a prisoner almost all his life. His blood had made him valuable to plotters and frightening to kings. In the end, it made him expendable. Henry VII had won. Again and again he had won. Yet each victory taught him that the throne could never be left unattended. The years passed. The country grew calmer on the surface. Trade increased. Royal authority hardened into routine. Henry's children grew in the protected warmth of court life. Arthur, the eldest son and heir, Margaret, destined for Scotland, Henry, the lively second son, and their sisters, each carrying a portion of the dynasty's carefully arranged future. Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess whose arrival promised a powerful alliance. Their wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral glittered with candles, embroidered cloth, music, and the formal happiness of a nation watching its future take shape. The young prince and his bride were sent to Ludlow, near the Welsh border, to begin their household. Then, in the spring of 1502, Arthur died. He was 15 years old. The cause was uncertain, perhaps a sweating sickness or some illness that moved quickly through damp rooms and weakened bodies. Whatever the precise cause, his death broke the pattern Henry had tried so carefully to make. The heir was gone. The marriage alliance remained, but its purpose had changed. The spare, the young Prince Henry, was now heir to the throne. At court, the sounds of mourning replaced the sounds of celebration. Black cloth was drawn across rooms. Footsteps became quiet. Bells tolled over towns and villages, their deep notes dissolving into the cold spring air. Henry VII, who had spent his life securing the Tudor future, had to look at the empty place where that future had seemed most certain. His grief was personal, but it was also political. A dynasty rests heavily upon the bodies of its children. One fever, one difficult birth, one unexpected illness could rearrange the fate of kingdoms. Elizabeth of York, Arthur's mother, mourned with him. Then, less than a year later, she became pregnant again. Perhaps there was hope that another son might bring comfort and reassurance. But in February 1503 she gave birth to a daughter and died soon afterwards at the Tower of London, on her 37th birthday. The new baby, Catherine, did not survive long. For Henry VII, the losses gathered like winter clouds. Elizabeth had been more than a queen. Her Yorkist blood had helped make his rule acceptable. Her presence had joined two damaged houses in the eyes of England. And beyond politics, by all signs, Henry cared deeply for her. Her death left the palace altered. The rooms where she had walked were still furnished with rich cloth and polished wood, but absence has its own weight. It sits in empty chairs. It lingers in corridors after the servants have gone. It makes the flame of a candle seem smaller. Henry did not remarry, though there were discussions and possibilities. He turned instead towards business, diplomacy, and the close management of his household. The king who had begun as an uncertain claimant became more guarded still. His health declined. His face in portraits grew thinner and more solemn. The watchful eyes remained. He had lived long enough to see the great Yorkist threats fade. He had survived rebels, pretenders, invasions, conspiracies, and the shifting loyalties of Europe. He had made the crown solvent. He had left his eldest surviving son trained, educated, and ready to inherit. But peace, for Henry VII, was never a bright meadow beneath a clear sky. It was a locked room, a sealed letter, a guard awake before dawn. It was the knowledge that beyond every wall someone might remember another king. In April 1509, Henry VII died at Richmond Palace. He was 52 years old. Outside, the spring air moved softly through the gardens. The river flowed on beneath the windows, carrying reflections of pale sky and bare branches. Within the palace, officials and servants moved carefully through rooms thick with ceremony and grief. His son Henry, not yet 18, became Henry VIII. The new king inherited the crown that his father had guarded so fiercely. He inherited the treasury, the alliances, the castles, the laws, and the careful machinery of authority. He also inherited something less visible, the fear that a Tudor crown could never be entirely secure. For a little while, the young king would seem to stand in sunlight. Music would rise in the halls. Gold would shine on tournament fields. England would look towards its handsome new monarch and imagine a more generous age. But beneath the music, beneath the bright banners and the sound of cheering crowds, the old shadows of Bosworth remained. When Henry VIII became king in the spring of 1509, England seemed to wake from a long, cautious winter. The old king, Henry VII, had ruled with a careful hand. He had counted coins, measured loyalties, and kept the doors of power firmly closed against the restless ambitions of the nobility. His court had been orderly, reserved, and watchful. Men had lowered their voices when they spoke of the crown. They had remembered Bosworth, the pretenders, the Tower, and the quiet danger of being too closely connected to a rival claim. Then the young Henry came to the throne. He was not yet 18. He was tall, broad-shouldered, bright-haired, and full of the easy physical confidence that seemed to belong to another age. He rode well, hunted eagerly, played music, spoke Latin and French, and excelled at the rituals expected of a Renaissance prince. To those who gathered around him, he appeared as England's new beginning. The sombre rooms of his father's reign filled with sound. Lutes, trumpets, laughter, the clatter of cups at feasts, and the excited murmur of courtiers eager to discover what the young king might become. In the great halls, candles shone upon embroidered sleeves and jewelled chains. The heavy tapestries seemed less like barriers against the draught and more like bright backdrops for a court beginning to enjoy itself again. In the courtyards, horses stamped upon the cobbles, their breath clouding in the cool morning air. Boys ran errands between kitchens and chambers. Falcons shifted on gloved hands. Everywhere there was movement. Yet even in this new brightness, the Tudor dynasty rested upon an absence. Henry was king because his elder brother Arthur had died. Arthur Tudor had been the child for whom the future was arranged. He had been named for the legendary king of ancient Britain, a name chosen with care by his father and grandmother. The Tudors were not an old royal house. and they understood the power of story. Arthur's name suggested ancient destiny, a return to greatness, a line rooted not simply in the uncertain aftermath of civil war, but in the deep, misty past of the island itself. From childhood, Arthur had been prepared to rule. Tutors shaped his learning. Courtiers measured his manners. His household formed around him, a small imitation of a king's court. When he was still young, his marriage was arranged to Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Catherine came from one of the most formidable royal families in Europe. Her parents had united much of Spain, conquered Granada, sponsored voyages across the Atlantic, and built a reputation for religious devotion and political resolve. To marry their daughter was to bind England to a powerful continental alliance. For Henry VII, who had spent his life protecting his fragile dynasty, it was a triumph of diplomacy. Catherine arrived in England in the autumn of 1501. She was 15 years old, travelling through a country that was still unfamiliar to her. Its grey skies, its damp roads, its dark oak halls, and the strange sounds of English spoken around her. At St. Paul's Cathedral, she married Arthur in a ceremony rich with colour and ceremony. Gold cloth gleamed beneath candlelight. Incense rose into the great height of the church. Bells travelled across London, their sound flowing over tiled roofs and narrow streets. Arthur was 15 as well. The two young people stood before the altar in the formal splendour of their family's ambitions. Their marriage was watched by noblemen, bishops, ambassadors, and servants, who understood that kingdoms could turn on the health of a single royal child. After the wedding, Arthur and Catherine were sent to Ludlow Castle, near the Welsh border. The castle stood above the River Tame, its old stone walls looking down across the countryside. There, in the colder air of the Welsh marches, Arthur was to learn the work of governing. He was Prince of Wales, and Ludlow had long been associated with the training of English heirs. The young couple established their household among the echoing rooms and narrow passages of the castle. Fires burned in fireplaces too large to warm every corner. Wind moved around the towers. Rain struck the leaded windows. Outside, the ground turned dark and soft beneath the feet of horses and servants. Inside, the life of a royal household continued with its ordinary sounds. Trays carried through corridors, doors opening and closing, the murmur of prayer from a chapel, the gentle scraping of pens across paper. Then illness came. In the spring of 1502, Arthur and Catherine fell sick. The exact nature of their illness has never been certain. It may have been a sweating sickness or some other infection that passed quickly through their household. The old records do not provide a comforting answer. They tell only of fever, weakness, and a sudden change in the air around the young prince's rooms. Catherine recovered. Arthur did not. On the 2nd of April, 1502, the heir to the Tudor throne died at Ludlow. He was 15 years old. The bells that had rung for his wedding rang again, now slower and deeper. Across England, the news moved along muddy roads and through market towns. The prince was dead. The future had shifted. In royal chambers, candles burned beside black cloth. In the quiet after, official announcements, there would have been the particular stillness that follows a death no one has prepared to receive. For Henry VII, Arthur's death was more than personal grief. It reopened the fear that had never entirely left him. His dynasty was young. His claim had been questioned. His security had been built slowly, coin by coin, marriage by marriage, warning by warning. Now the son he had fashioned as the next king was gone. The younger prince Henry became heir. He had once stood in the background of the royal family, lively and promising, but not burdened with the full weight of expectation. His future had been meant for the church, or for some great dukedom, perhaps for a life that did not require every breath to be judged by the needs of the kingdom. Arthur had been the one destined for the crown. Arthur had been married to Catherine. Arthur had been sent to Ludlow. But the crown does not wait for a family to be ready. Young Henry was given new titles and new responsibilities. He became Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, and heir to a throne that had suddenly become far more demanding. Around him, the atmosphere changed. Tutors, councillors, and household officers began to look at him differently. His words mattered more. His health mattered more. The way he stood, the way he rode, the friends he chose, the thoughts he expressed, all were now of consequence. Catherine of Aragon remained in England. Her position was delicate from the beginning. She had been sent across the sea to marry the heir to England, but that heir was dead. Her dowry had not been fully paid. Her parents wished to preserve the English alliance. Henry VII wished to preserve it too, but he also wished to avoid financial loss and political embarrassment. Catherine, still a teenager, became entangled in negotiations conducted by older men across long distances. There was one obvious solution. She might marry Henry, Arthur's younger brother. But that possibility carried a problem which, at first, seemed to belong to lawyers and churchmen. Under Christian law, a man was forbidden to marry his brother's widow. The rule came from Scripture, from words in the book of Leviticus that would one day echo through palaces and courts with enormous force. Yet there could be an exception if the Pope granted a special dispensation. The question turned on the marriage of Arthur and Catherine. Had it been consummated? Catherine maintained that it had not. She had married Arthur, she said, but they had never fully become husband and wife. She had arrived at Ludlow as a young girl, and Arthur had been frail. Whatever had passed between them remained hidden behind the curtains and closed doors of their marriage chamber. But in time, this private matter would become one of the most disputed questions in Europe. For now, the people around Catherine sought a path forward. A papal dispensation was obtained, broad enough to permit a marriage between her and Henry, whether or not the first marriage had been consummated. Yet even with the document, the proposed union moved slowly. Henry VII was cautious. He considered other alliances. Catherine's life in England became uncertain and at times uncomfortable. She had attendants, but not the settled dignity of a princess whose place was secure. Letters travelled between England and Spain, folded and sealed, carried over rough seas and wet roads. Each message could alter her prospects. Then, in February 1503, Elizabeth of York died. She had given birth to a daughter, Catherine, who survived only a few days. The Queen died on her 37th birthday. Her death brought another darkness to the Tudor household. Henry VII had lost his eldest son only a year before. Now he lost his wife, the Yorkist princess whose marriage had helped unite the country after decades of war. The king grew more withdrawn. The court became quieter. There were still ceremonies and business, still diplomatic visitors and formal meals. But grief had entered the rooms. The sound of a door closing at the end of a corridor seemed sharper. The rain against the palace windows seemed to last longer. Under the careful arrangement of royal life, the family's foundation had been shaken. Young Henry was now not merely the heir, but the only surviving son. This fact settled around him with a silent pressure. He was protected, watched, and carefully managed. His father kept him close. Henry did not move freely through public life as an adult prince might have expected. He was guarded from danger, perhaps guarded too closely. The old king had known how quickly a boy's death could change the fate of a dynasty. Meanwhile, Catherine waited. Years passed. She grew from a princess into a young woman while her future remained unresolved. She practiced her faith with seriousness and quiet routine. She wrote letters. She waited for money from Spain. She watched the English court from a position both honoured and insecure. She was the widow of one prince and the possible bride of another, though the second prince was still very young. In the great houses where she stayed, mornings began with the sound of servants stirring fires and drawing curtains against the grey light. The smell of smoke gathered beneath beams darkened by years of winter. In the chapel, her rosary beads passed steadily through her fingers. Each prayer followed the next with a familiar rhythm, a small certainty in a life arranged by other people. The marriage to Prince Henry was eventually agreed. In 1509, only weeks after the death of Henry VII, the young king chose Catherine as his queen. The decision was swift, almost joyful. Henry had inherited not only the crown but a ready-made alliance, a bride of royal blood, and a marriage long anticipated by those around. Him. On the 11th of June, Henry and Catherine were married in a private ceremony at Greenwich. Less than 2 weeks later, they were crowned together at Westminster Abbey. London was alive with celebration. The streets were crowded, flags moved above the houses, bells sounded from church towers. The river carried royal barges past cheering people gathered along the banks. At Westminster, the old abbey shone with candles. Incense curled in the dimness beneath the high vaults. The young king wore cloth of gold. Catherine, smaller beside him but composed and radiant, was crowned queen. They seemed well matched in the eyes of their subjects. Henry was handsome, vigorous, and newly powerful. Catherine was learned, devout, and the daughter of famous monarchs. Together they represented strength, youth, and continuity. To England, still marked by memories of instability, their union appeared to promise a settled future. For a time there was genuine affection between them. Henry called Catherine his most dear and entirely beloved wife. She supported him with intelligence and loyalty. She could speak Spanish, French, Latin, and English. She understood European politics. In 1513, while Henry campaigned in France, he appointed her regent in England. From Richmond and other royal residences, Catherine directed affairs of state. When the Scots invaded from the north under James IV, English forces met them at Flodden. The battle was brutal, fought beneath a lowering sky in Northumberland. James IV was killed, along with many Scottish nobles. Catherine sent Henry a piece of the Scottish king's blood-stained coat, a stark token of victory carried south while the English king remained abroad. She had shown that she was capable of command. Beneath her formal gowns and embroidered sleeves was a queen who understood the hardness of royal power. But the splendour of the early years could not silence the question that had troubled every Tudor generation. Who would inherit? Catherine became pregnant soon after the marriage. The court waited. The kingdom waited. Every royal pregnancy was watched with reverence and fear. In palace nurseries, linen was prepared, cradles polished, and fires kept warm. Midwives moved quietly through passages. Ladies waited behind closed doors. Outside, church bells might be ready to announce the birth of a prince. In January 1510, Catherine gave birth to a daughter stillborn. The loss was wrapped in ritual and sorrow. A small body, scarcely seen by the world, was buried. The court recovered its composure. There would be other pregnancies. There had to be. Later that year, Catherine became pregnant again. On the first day of January 1511, she gave birth to a son. He was named Henry, Duke of Cornwall. This time, England rejoiced. The bells rang, bonfires were lit, wine flowed. The longed-for male heir had arrived, and with him came the brief, shining sense that the future was secure. The infant prince was displayed with pride. The king and queen had given England what it expected from them: a boy, a continuation, a living answer to the fears that had begun at Bosworth. But the prince died after only 52 days. The celebrations faded into mourning. The fires burned down. The bells grew quiet. In the royal apartments, there was once more the muted movement of attendants carrying away things prepared for a child who would no longer use them. A tiny gown, perhaps, folded into a chest. A cradle left empty. The air of a nursery, too warm and too still. Henry and Catherine had lost their son. They did not yet know that this would become a pattern of hope and loss, repeated until it reshaped their marriage and altered the course of England. Other pregnancies followed. Some ended early. Some brought children who lived only hours or days. The records are incomplete and uncertain in places, but the grief was real. There was a son born in 1513 who died soon after birth. Another son in 1515 also lost. For Catherine, the experience must have been exhausting in body and spirit. Each pregnancy brought ceremony, expectation, and prayers. Each loss brought silence. The king was still young. He continued to hunt, joust, feast, and wage war. His court remained splendid. At tournaments, his armour gleamed in the sun. Horses raced across the tilt-yard. Trumpets sounded from balconies. Ladies watched from galleries draped in rich fabric. Henry seemed to enjoy every visible sign of his majesty. The tilt of a lance, the applause of a crowd, the weight of a golden chain across his chest. Yet behind the pageantry, the succession remained uncertain. In February 1516, Catherine gave birth to a daughter who survived. She was named Mary. The child was welcomed with affection, though not with the uncomplicated relief that would have greeted a son. Mary was a healthy infant, solemnly baptized and carefully tended. Her parents loved her. Henry took pride in her learning as she grew, and Catherine devoted herself to her daughter. But a girl, however cherished, did not resolve the fears of a dynasty only a generation removed from civil war. England had known female rulers in theory, but not a woman who had ruled securely in her own right. The memory of Matilda, whose claim in the 12th century had brought years of conflict, was still part of the country's political imagination. A daughter could inherit, perhaps, but her marriage might bring a foreign husband into English affairs. Rival claimants might rise. Noblemen might divide. The old wounds of York and Lancaster might begin to ache again. Henry's need for a son was not merely vanity, though vanity would later play its part. It was entwined with the history he had inherited. His father had spent a lifetime preventing rivals from gathering around an alternative heir. Henry VIII had watched Arthur die. He had watched his parents grieve. He knew that the Tudor line was narrow. Catherine conceived again in 1518 and gave birth to another daughter who died soon afterwards. By then, the rhythm of disappointment had become familiar. The king's advisers could speak reassuringly. Priests could offer prayers. Physicians could recommend their remedies, herbs, diet, rest, warmth, careful observance. But no advice could command a child to live. The royal marriage began to change, almost imperceptibly at first. Henry still treated Catherine with public respect. She remained queen, dignified and admired. But he sought comfort elsewhere. Like many kings of his age, he took mistresses. One of the most notable was Elizabeth Blount, who gave birth in 1519 to his acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. The birth was a complicated comfort. It proved, at least in Henry's mind, that he could father a healthy boy. The child was given the name Fitzroy, meaning son of the king, and granted high titles. For a brief moment, there were whispers that Henry might consider making him heir, but an illegitimate son could not easily quiet the kingdom's anxieties. The crown required certainty, and certainty was the one thing Henry lacked. As the years moved on, Catherine's chances of bearing another child grew smaller. She was deeply religious, devoted to the old faith, and convinced of the sacred truth of her marriage. She had been married to Henry for many years. She had served as queen, regent, diplomat, wife, and mother. Her identity was bound to the vows spoken before God. Henry's mind, meanwhile, began to circle around an old and dangerous question. He had married his brother's widow. The papal dispensation had allowed it. Catherine had always insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. But the old words from Leviticus remained. A man who took his brother's wife, the passage warned, would be childless. For years Henry had not treated the verse as a threat. Now, after so many lost children, and with only Mary surviving, it took on a darker meaning. Perhaps he began to wonder, God had withheld a son because the marriage itself was wrong. Perhaps the Pope had granted permission for something that heaven would not permit. Perhaps the deaths of the princes and infants were not random sorrow, but judgment. Such thoughts did not arrive all at once. They gathered slowly like clouds over a familiar landscape. A line of scripture read in private, a conversation with a confessor, the sight of Mary growing older, clever and beloved, but undeniably a girl, the memory of Arthur, dead at 15, the knowledge that Catherine had once been Arthur's wife. The question became difficult to escape. Around the king, the court was changing too. New advisers and new ideas moved through its corridors. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's brilliant chief minister, had raised royal government to extraordinary heights. He arranged treaties, negotiated with foreign powers, and built grand houses that expressed his confidence. But even Wolsey could not make time stand still. The king was no longer the golden young prince of 1509. He was approaching 40. His marriage had produced no surviving son. The line of Tudor kings still depended upon one uncertain future. And then, among the ladies of Catherine's household, Henry noticed Anne Boleyn. Anne was not merely beautiful in the conventional language of courtly praise. Contemporaries described her as dark-haired, lively, elegant, and possessing striking eyes. More importantly, she was intelligent and alert. She had spent years abroad, first in the Netherlands and then at the French court. She had absorbed the polish, music, fashion, and religious ideas of Renaissance Europe. She knew how to speak, how to listen, and how to withhold herself. Her sister Mary Boleyn had already been the king's mistress. Anne would not follow the same path so easily. At first, she appeared in the shifting, scented world of court entertainments, dancing at masques, speaking with ladies near a window, moving through galleries where candlelight flickered upon polished wood and painted ceilings. The air would have carried perfume, smoke, wax, and the faint smell of damp wool brought in from the outdoors. Musicians played softly while courtiers watched one another behind careful smiles. Henry was drawn towards her. Yet Anne did not offer the simple, discreet arrangement that the king might have expected. She resisted becoming his mistress. She expected more. Whether through calculation, conviction, or an instinctive understanding of her own value, she held him at a distance. A letter might be answered slowly. A glance might be given and then withdrawn. The king, accustomed to command, encountered something that could not be ordered into obedience. The consequence was profound. Henry's desire for Anne became entangled with his desire for a son, his fear of divine judgment, and his need to secure the Tudor line. The private longings of a king began to press against the walls of religion and law. What had once been a shadowed thought, the possibility that his marriage to Catherine was invalid, began to take the shape of a demand. In quiet rooms, documents were examined. The papal dispensation was read again. The old marriage to Arthur was discussed. Witnesses were considered. Theological arguments emerged from books and sermons. The king's conscience, as he described it, had become troubled. But for Catherine, the matter was not an argument assembled from papers and verses. It was her life. She had crossed the sea as a girl. She had buried children. She had stood beside Henry through war, ceremony, illness, and years of shared rule. She had raised Mary with devotion. Her marriage had been recognized by church and kingdom for nearly 2 decades. To question it now was to ask her to step out of her own history and become, in effect, a mistake. The palace still glittered. Feasts continued. Hunting parties rode out beneath autumn leaves. In chapels, voices rose in prayer. But something had shifted beneath the familiar sound of court life. At night, rain tapped against high windows. In distant corridors, a servant's shoes made a soft, hurried sound upon the rushes. Somewhere, a candle burned beside an open Bible. Somewhere else, a queen turned rosary beads slowly through her fingers. And in the mind of the king, an old grief had become an accusation. Arthur's empty bed at Ludlow, long ago and far away, had begun to cast its shadow over everything. Anne Boleyn had been crowned beneath the high, shadowed vaults of Westminster Abbey in June 1533, while bells sounded across London and the river carried bright royal barges beneath a summer sky. She had entered the abbey in velvet and cloth of gold, surrounded by noble women and guarded by the hopes of a king who believed that his long struggle had at last brought him towards certainty. Yet the certainty Henry VIII wanted was not a crown upon Anne's head. It was a son. When Anne gave birth in September of that year, the palace had been prepared for the arrival of a prince. Astrologers had made hopeful predictions. Courtiers had spoken with careful confidence. The rooms at Greenwich had been arranged with linen, candles, polished silver, and all the quiet preparations that attended the birth of a royal child. Outside, the Thames moved past the palace walls, carrying boats through the grey-green water. In the kitchens, fires burned steadily beneath great iron pots. Servants passed along passages with trays and folded cloth. listening for the message that would decide the mood of the kingdom. The child was a girl. She was named Elizabeth. The disappointment was immediate, though not openly spoken in the first moments. A healthy daughter was still a blessing. She was a princess, born to a king and queen. Yet the elaborate announcements and preparations made for the birth of a prince could not be entirely hidden. Some letters had already been drafted with the word prince in mind. The jousts intended to celebrate a son were cancelled. In the royal nurseries, the bright expectations settled into a quieter kind of acceptance. Anne held her daughter, small and warm beneath swaddling cloth, and looked upon the future in a different form from the one she had been promised. Elizabeth's birth did not make Anne powerless. On the contrary, she remained queen, and Henry still believed that more children would come. He was 42, strong, commanding, and accustomed to receiving the future he imagined. Anne was young enough to conceive again. One daughter could be followed by a son. The court told itself this story with the persistence of a prayer. But beneath the polished surface of royal life, tension began to gather. Anne had risen too high too quickly, and in doing so she had displaced a queen whom many people still loved. Catherine of Aragon had died only a few years after her marriage was set aside, but the memory of her remained powerful. Her daughter Mary continued to refuse Anne's authority. Those who had served Catherine saw Anne not as a new beginning, but as the source of rupture. The woman for whom the king had broken with Rome, rejected his first wife, and changed the laws of England. Anne's own nature did not make her enemies fewer. She could be generous to those she trusted and fiercely protective of her family. She supported scholars and clergy who favoured religious reform. She gave money to charity. She took an interest in petitions brought before her. But she could also be sharp-tongued, proud, and quick to anger. At court, where every expression was noticed and every careless word might be repeated, such qualities could become dangerous. The palace was a place of beauty, but it was never simple. At Hampton Court, Greenwich, Whitehall, and the Tower, richly furnished rooms concealed the work of constant observation. Gentlemen and ladies bowed, smiled, and exchanged courtesies beneath painted ceilings. Velvet sleeves brushed against one another near fireplaces. Jewels flashed in candlelight. But the warmth of a room could change when a door opened. Conversation stopped. A name might be spoken softly, then carried elsewhere by someone who had listened without seeming to listen. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, had risen in rank. Her brother George became Lord Rochford, admired for his learning and charm. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, stood among the kingdom's most powerful men. Her sister Mary had long since stepped back from the centre of court life, but the Boleyn family remained close to the throne. Their success brought wealth and influence. It also brought resentment. Many noble families had watched the Boleyns rise with a mixture of astonishment and dislike. The family was old and respectable, but not of the highest rank. Anne's queenship had transformed their fortunes. Positions, grants, and opportunities seemed to flow towards her relatives and allies. To those outside the circle, the Boleyns could appear everywhere, in council chambers, royal households, church appointments, and the private rooms where royal favour was granted. The king's favour, however, was a weather that could change without warning. For a time, Anne's most important ally was Thomas Cromwell. He was not a nobleman by birth, but he possessed an extraordinary understanding of power. He had served Cardinal Wolsey and survived his master's fall. He had helped Henry break from Rome and establish royal supremacy over the English Church. His mind moved easily through law, finance, and diplomacy and administration. In a world where many men relied upon old family connections, Cromwell relied upon information, documents, and a remarkable ability to understand what the king wanted before it had fully been spoken. Anne and Cromwell shared some interests. Both were sympathetic to religious reform. Both supported the distribution of certain religious texts in English. Both had helped advance the changes that made Anne's marriage possible. Yet they did not share the same ambitions. As the monasteries began to be dissolved, their wealth became a source of disagreement. Cromwell saw an opportunity to strengthen the crown and reward those who would support the new order. Anne, though no enemy of reform, hoped that some of the wealth might be directed towards education and charitable causes. Their alliance began to fray in private conversations, in letters, and in the long silences that followed meetings. At the same time, Henry's eyes began to wander. Jane Seymour was one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. She was quieter in manner than Anne, pale and fair, from a family of ancient standing in Wiltshire. The Seymours understood the lessons taught by the Boleyn rise. They knew that a young woman close to the king could become the centre of a family's hopes. Jane did not display the French brilliance or restless intelligence that had once captivated Henry and Anne. Instead, she presented a gentler image, modest, obedient, domestic, and perhaps safer. The king began to send her gifts. The gestures were small at first, or small enough to be explained away. A letter, a purse of coins, a private sign of attention. But nothing at the Tudor court remained private for long. Anne learned that Henry's interest had shifted. She had watched the same thing happen years earlier, when Catherine of Aragon stood in the place she now occupied. The knowledge must have been bitter. A queen who had been chosen for her promise of a son could not afford to become merely familiar. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle. Her final days had been quiet, held within the narrow world permitted to her after Henry rejected her. She had never accepted the title of Dowager Princess of Wales. She had continued to think of herself as queen, and many in England continued to think of her in the same way. News of Catherine's death reached the royal court. The old obstacle, as Henry may have seen her, was gone. Yet her death did not bring Anne peace. It brought a strange and unsettled moment. Henry and Anne wore yellow, a colour associated in Spain with mourning, though observers interpreted it in different ways. Some believed they mourned Catherine. Others thought they celebrated their freedom from her presence. The ambiguity clung to the scene like smoke. Anne was pregnant again. This pregnancy was watched with greater intensity than the first. A son would silence many doubts. It would establish Anne's place, secure Elizabeth's future, and give Henry the heir he had sought through so much upheaval. The court waited beneath the weight of that expectation. Then, late in January, Anne miscarried. The child was a boy. The loss came after a disturbing incident at Greenwich. Henry had been injured in a jousting accident, thrown from his horse and briefly left unconscious. The sound of alarm moved quickly through the palace. Horses were led away, their hooves striking the ground in agitation. Men hurried across the tilt-yard. In the galleries, ladies gathered close together, their voices low. For a short and dreadful time, it seemed possible that the king might die. Anne was shaken by the news. Soon afterwards, she lost the child. The miscarriage became more than grief. To Henry, it seemed to confirm a fear that was already forming within him. Anne had not given him the promised son. Her first child had been a daughter, now the second, whom he had expected to live, was gone. In the shadowed logic of Tudor belief, misfortune rarely appeared to be mere chance. It could be read as warning, punishment, or proof that God had turned away. Henry had once persuaded himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had been his brother's widow. Now, perhaps, he began to wonder whether Anne's marriage had also failed to win divine favour. The Queen's position weakened swiftly. She still had supporters. She was still officially beloved by the king. Publicly, the rituals of court continued, but the atmosphere around her changed. Henry became colder. Jane Seymour's family grew more confident. Cromwell, now estranged from Anne and anxious to preserve his own standing, began to see that the Queen might be removed. The method by which she was removed remains one of the darkest mysteries of the Tudor age. In the spring of 1536, rumours began to spread that Anne had taken lovers. At first, there was no public accusation. There were only whispers, the kind that slipped through palace corridors and became louder with each telling. A queen's smile at a courtier could be remembered as flirtation. A conversation held behind a screen could be described as secrecy. A joke made at supper could become evidence of something more dangerous. The men eventually accused were astonishingly close to Anne's world. Mark Smeaton was a musician in the royal household, skilled with instruments and known for his ability to entertain. Henry Norris was a groom of the stool, one of the king's trusted attendants. Sir Francis Weston was young, well-connected, and often present at court. William Brereton was a gentleman with influence in Wales, and George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, Lord Rochford, was accused of incest with the Queen. The charges were adultery, treason, and in George's case, incest. The alleged affairs were said to have taken place across months and in various royal residences. Yet many of the dates were implausible. On some occasions, Anne was elsewhere, pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or closely attended. The accusations had the strange, hurried quality of a story, constructed backwards from a desired ending. Still, in Henry's England, an accusation did not need to be convincing to be dangerous. The first arrest came at the end of April. Mark Smeaton was taken for questioning. What happened during his interrogation remains uncertain. He eventually confessed, though whether he did so under torture, pressure, fear, or persuasion cannot be known with confidence. His confession became a key piece of the case. The others were arrested in the days that followed. The court changed almost overnight. Doors closed. Guards appeared. Servants carried messages through passages that had recently been filled with the sounds of music and ordinary ceremony. Men who had eaten with the Queen, danced near her, or accepted her favour now had reason to fear that their names might be spoken next. Anne herself was arrested on the 2nd of May. She had been watching a game of tennis at Greenwich when she was summoned before the King's Council. The sky outside was likely pale and unsettled, as English spring skies often are. The courtrooms and galleries carried the faint smell of rain brought in on cloaks. She was questioned about the accusations, then told that she would be taken to the Tower of London. The journey down the Thames was one she had made before. In 1533 she had travelled by royal barge to the Tower in triumph before her coronation. Then the river had been bright with banners, music, and crowded boats. Now, 3 years later, She travelled under guard. The oars entered the water with a slow, regular sound. The walls of the tower rose ahead, grey and ancient beside the river. Anne watched the familiar outline approach, perhaps remembering that earlier journey, the cheering crowds, the shining expectation of her queenship. The contrast must have seemed almost unreal, like a pageant transformed into a dream of punishment. She was lodged in the royal apartments where she had once prepared to become queen. The rooms were not bare. They had fireplaces, windows, and some of the furnishings proper to royal dignity. Yet every comfort was altered by the presence of guards and the knowledge that she could not leave. The tower's stone walls held the chill of the river air. Footsteps sounded differently in its passages. Keys moved in locks. Boats passed below, and the city continued its life beyond reach. Anne's behaviour in the tower was observed and recorded by Sir William Kingston, the constable. His letters offer glimpses of a woman moving between disbelief, fear, anger, prayer, and moments of strained laughter. At times she asked where she would die. She had heard that queens were not executed within the tower, but she was told that the scaffold would be built on the green inside its walls. She remarked upon the smallness of her neck, perhaps with a dark attempt at courage, perhaps with the restless speech of someone trying to survive terror, one moment at a time. She spoke of the men accused with her. She tried to understand why certain names had been chosen. She remembered conversations and gestures. She denied guilt. She wept. Then at other times, she sang or laughed suddenly, the sound unsettling in the enclosed rooms. It is easy to imagine the tower as a place of constant dramatic noise, but much of its cruelty lay in waiting. Hours passed slowly. A servant arranged clothing. A meal was carried in. A chapel bell sounded beyond the walls. Rain might tick against a window. Somewhere in the courtyard, a guard coughed or shifted his feet. Anne's mind returned again and again to the same questions. What had the king decided? What would happen to Elizabeth? Who had spoken against her? Was there any way to persuade Henry to remember what she had once been to him? But the king had already begun to move forward. On the 12th of May, the 4 commoner accused men were tried at Westminster Hall. Smeaton, Norris, Weston and Brereton were found guilty. Their trials unfolded beneath the high timbered roof, before judges and spectators who knew that acquittal was unlikely. The law, in such moments, became a formal garment draped over a political decision. 3 days later, Anne and George Boleyn were tried in the King's Hall at the Tower. George defended himself with skill, but he was condemned. Anne stood before a court that included her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, serving as Lord High Steward. The family connections that had once raised her up now formed part of the machinery around her fall. She denied the accusations. She spoke clearly. Witnesses and documents offered little firm proof, but the verdict was never seriously in doubt. The peers found her guilty of adultery, incest, and treason. The sentence was death by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. In the hall, the words would have settled heavily in the air. A queen had been condemned. The wife for whom Henry had remade England was now described as a traitor. The woman once carried through London beneath triumphal banners was to die within the walls of the Tower. Henry chose beheading and arranged for a skilled swordsman from Calais to carry out the execution. This detail, often remembered as a rare mercy, had its own cold precision. The sword, unlike the axe, could be swift in the hands of an expert. a French executioner was summoned across the Channel. Even in the Queen's final days, arrangements were made through letters, boats, payments, and formal instructions. The machinery of the state continued to turn. Anne prepared herself for death. She received the sacrament. She prayed. She made her final confession and, according to those present, solemnly declared her innocence. Her ladies attended her in the dim rooms. They helped her dress, arranged her hair, and tried to hold themselves steady as the hours narrowed. On the 17th of May, George Boleyn and the other condemned men were executed on Tower Hill, outside the fortress walls. From the tower, Anne may have heard distant sounds carried by the wind, the movement of a crowd, the tolling of a bell, the dull final rhythm of public death. The men who had been part of her court, her family, or merely caught in the reach of the accusation, were gone. The next morning Anne waited. The execution was delayed. Perhaps the swordsman had not yet arrived. Perhaps the arrangements were not complete. For a prisoner, delay is a peculiar form of torment. Each sound in the corridor might seem like the beginning of the end. Each hour might offer a slender hope, then take it away. At last, on the morning of the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led from the tower to the scaffold. The day was cool. The grass inside the tower walls was damp beneath the feet of those gathered there. A small crowd of officials, courtiers, guards, and selected witnesses waited in quiet expectation. The city beyond continued to wake. Somewhere, merchants were opening shutters. Carts rolled over cobblestones. The Thames moved beneath a pale sky. Anne wore a grey damask gown beneath a mantle of ermine, according to some accounts, with a small English-style hood covering her hair. She climbed the scaffold and addressed those assembled. Her speech was careful. She did not accuse Henry. She did not protest the injustice of the charges. Instead, she spoke of him as a good and gentle sovereign and asked the people to pray for her. Her words were shaped by the realities of the moment. To die well was considered important. To meet death with composure could preserve a final measure of dignity. Perhaps she also hoped to protect Elizabeth, who was only 2 years old and now depended entirely upon the mercy of the father who had abandoned Anne. Then she knelt. Her ladies removed her jewellery and covered her eyes with a cloth. The French swordsman waited nearby, his blade hidden from her view. He distracted her attention, calling for the sword as though it were not yet ready. In that brief instant, while Anne listened for a sound elsewhere, the blade fell. Her death was swift. For a moment, the small gathering stood in silence. Birds sang somewhere beyond the walls. The air moved over the grass. Then the ordinary work of aftermath began. Anne's body was placed in a simple elm chest, one that had been found at short notice, and buried in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. There was no grand funeral, no procession through London, no great monument built in her honour. The Queen was gone. Henry's response appeared astonishingly quick. The day after Anne's execution, he became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. 10 days later, they were married. The palace had scarcely finished absorbing one death before it prepared for another wedding. Fresh cloth was hung, meals were served, music returned. Courtiers adjusted their expressions and learned the new order. Jane was now queen. Elizabeth, Anne's little daughter, was declared illegitimate, just as Mary had been declared illegitimate before her. The child's household was reduced. She was moved away from the centre of court life to be raised among servants, tutors, and the distant echoes of events she could not yet understand. She had lost her mother before she was old enough to remember her clearly. Yet the circumstances of Anne's death would become part of the invisible inheritance Elizabeth carried throughout her life. She would grow up knowing that a king's love could become deadly, that marriage could be a trap, and that a woman close to the throne could be both adored and destroyed. For Henry, Anne's death did not bring the peace he had expected. He had removed a queen, silenced accusations, and married a woman he believed would be more obedient. Yet the deeper problem remained. The crown still had no legitimate son. The kingdom had been divided by religious change. Catherine's supporters still mourned her. Anne's enemies had been satisfied, but satisfaction was not the same as stability. The Tudor court continued beneath its velvet and gold, but it had changed. The sound of Anne's death travelled beyond the tower. It moved through letters written in cautious language, through sermons, whispered conversations, and the private memories of those who had watched her ascend and fall. It became part of the atmosphere of Henry's reign, a warning carried through corridors, a shadow at the edge of every royal marriage. In the years that followed, portraits would show Anne composed and elegant, her dark eyes looking outward from beneath a French hood, a string of pearls resting against her gown. They could not show the narrow rooms of the tower, the river mist, the wet grass, or the anxious movement of her hands as she waited for judgment. They could not show the little girl named Elizabeth, growing older in a world where her mother's name was dangerous to speak. But beneath the stillness of painted faces, the memory endured. The morning after Anne Boleyn's execution, the court began to dress itself in new colours. Within the Tower of London, the damp grass of the scaffold green still held the memory of the previous day. The elm chest in which Anne had been buried rested beneath the stone floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The river moved past the tower walls with its usual grey, patient motion. Boats passed beneath the shadow of the fortress. London woke to its markets, its bells, its carts upon the cobbles, and the ordinary labour of a city that had learned to continue after royal tragedy. But Henry VIII did not linger in mourning. On the 20th of May 1536, scarcely 24 hours after Anne's death, he became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. 10 days later, they were married at Whitehall Palace. The ceremony was modest by royal standards. There was no great public coronation for Jane, no procession through the city, no crown placed upon her head beneath the high vaults of Westminster Abbey. Perhaps Henry had learned that ceremonies could not secure the future. Perhaps the memory of Anne's coronation was too close. Or perhaps, more simply, the king wished to wait for what mattered most. A son. Jane Seymour brought a different atmosphere to Henry's life. Where Anne had been quick, clever, and shaped by the restless elegance of the French court, Jane appeared quiet and restrained. She had pale hair, a gentle manner, and the careful modesty that Henry had come to admire. Her family, the Seymours of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, belonged to the established gentry. They were not among the oldest and greatest houses of England, yet they understood the slow work of advancement. Jane's brothers, Edward and Thomas, had watched closely as the Boleyn family rose and fell. They knew that a sister's position beside the king could transform the fortunes of an entire household. Jane's queenly motto was said to be, "Bound to obey and serve." The words were reassuring to Henry. He had endured conflict with Catherine, who would not surrender her marriage, and with Anne, whose influence and force of character had become entangled with his own fears. Jane offered no challenge in public. She spoke softly. She honoured the king. She treated his daughter Mary with kindness. In these gestures, Henry saw not weakness but relief. Mary was now 20 years old. Her childhood had been marked by painful separations, humiliating declarations, and the knowledge that her father's favour could be withdrawn with startling speed. After Henry had rejected Catherine of Aragon, Mary had been declared illegitimate and forced to recognise Anne Boleyn as queen. She had been kept from her mother during Catherine's final illness. When Catherine died, Mary was not permitted to attend the funeral. Her grief had been private, guarded, and deep. Jane Seymour understood the value of bringing Mary back towards the king. She interceded carefully. She did not demand. She asked. Henry, still pleased by his new marriage and perhaps eager to create the image of a calmer household, allowed a reconciliation to begin. Mary submitted to her father's authority. She signed documents acknowledging him as supreme head of the Church of England and accepting, however painfully, that her parents' marriage had been invalid. The words on the parchment must have been hard for her to see. They denied the truth Catherine had defended until death. They reduced Mary's own claim and made obedience the price of returning to her father's affection. Yet Mary signed. She had learned what resistance could cost. A young woman at the Tudor court did not possess the freedom to stand alone forever. Once she had submitted, she was restored to favour. She returned to court, where Jane received her with warmth. The two women were close in age, though their lives had been shaped very differently. Mary was the king's daughter, educated, proud, and deeply attached to the old faith. Jane was the new queen, cautious, observant, and aware that her safety depended upon producing what Mary had never been able to offer: a male heir. For a short time, the royal household seemed almost peaceful. At Whitehall, the days unfolded in familiar ceremony. Servants moved through long galleries carrying polished dishes and folded linen. Fires glowed behind iron grates. The scent of roasting meat rose from the kitchens. In the chapel, voices lifted in prayer, softened by stone and distance. Outside, the Thames carried barges beneath the palace windows, oars dipping steadily into the brown water. Henry was now in his mid-40s. The golden athlete of his youth had changed. The old injury from his jousting accident had never healed fully. His leg troubled him, sometimes painfully. His body had grown heavier. His temper, already formidable, could flare with a force that made those around him still. Yet with Jane he appeared content. She did not try to rival him in argument or display. She created, or seemed to create, an atmosphere of domestic calm. The king's daughters were brought closer together. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was only 3 years old when Jane became queen. She had been declared illegitimate after her mother's execution and moved away from the centre of court life. She lived in her own household, attended by nurses, governesses, and servants who taught her the habits expected of a royal child. Her red hair and sharp features already distinguished her. Though she was very young, she had begun to form the quick, alert gaze that would later become so familiar in portraits. Jane treated Elizabeth with kindness as well. This was no small matter. Elizabeth was the child of the woman Jane had replaced. In another court, or under another queen, she might have been treated as an uncomfortable reminder. But Jane understood the need for appearances of harmony, and perhaps she possessed genuine affection for the child. Mary and Elizabeth were invited to court, placed in ceremonial order, and allowed to appear again within the orbit of their father's family. Even so, they remained illegitimate in law. The empty place beside them was still held by the son Henry wanted. In the spring of 1537, Jane became pregnant. The news moved through the palace with restrained excitement. No one wished to tempt fate by celebrating too loudly. Henry had watched too many pregnancies end in disappointment. The court had learned that royal hope must be spoken of carefully, as though a loud voice might disturb the fragile work happening behind closed doors. Jane withdrew from public display as her pregnancy advanced. Her rooms were kept warm and quiet. The windows were closed against draughts. Servants walked softly across the rushes. Her ladies attended her with constant care, bringing food, arranging cushions, reading prayers, and listening for any change in her health. Henry was attentive. He ordered that Jane's wishes be indulged. One story tells that she desired quail, a bird then out of season, and that Henry arranged for it to be brought from abroad. Whether every detail of the tale is true matters less than the image it preserves. A king willing to command ships and servants for the comfort of a pregnant queen. For Henry, Jane's body had become the centre of England's future. The months passed. Summer gave way to autumn. Leaves turned and fell in the palace gardens. The air grew sharper. In the evenings, candles were lit earlier. Rain touched the windows with a soft, persistent tapping. The nation waited for news from Hampton Court, where Jane had gone to await her confinement. Hampton Court was vast and red brick, its chimneys rising over the river. Its courtyards held the sound of footsteps and horses, doors opening, servants calling softly to one another. Inside, the rooms prepared for the birth were arranged according to ancient custom. The Queen's chamber was made dark and warm. Tapestries were hung to soften the walls. The bed was dressed with rich cloth. A fire burned. Light entered only in a controlled glow, because childbirth, in the imagination of the age, required enclosure and protection. On the 12th of October, 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son. The child was named Edward. At last, Henry had what he had sought through decades of marriage, disappointment and destruction. A legitimate male heir, born to a queen whose modesty and obedience had pleased him, had entered the world. The announcement travelled swiftly from Hampton Court. Bells rang in London. Bonfires were lit. The sound of celebration rose over the city, moving through streets already darkened by autumn evening. Henry was overcome with joy. Edward was baptized 3 days later in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. The ceremony took place by torchlight. The infant, wrapped in rich cloth, was carried through the dim, glowing rooms. His half-sister Mary acted as godmother, while little Elizabeth, not yet 4, was present in the formal household surrounding the child. The scene brought together the king's 3 surviving children, each born to a different queen, each carrying a different story of love, loss, legitimacy, and fear. For a moment, the Tudor family seemed complete, but Jane had not recovered. Her labour had been difficult and prolonged. In the days after Edward's birth, she weakened. The sounds of celebration beyond her rooms must have become distant and unreal. Her ladies moved quietly around the bed. Physicians came and went. Candles burned low. Prayers were whispered. The warm, enclosed chamber that had guarded her through childbirth became a place of uncertainty. Jane died on the 24th of October, 12 days after Edward's birth. she was 29 years old. The cause is often described as childbed fever, though the exact nature of her illness cannot be known. What remains is the simple, sorrowful sequence. She gave Henry the son he wanted, and then she died before she could see what her gift would bring. The bells that had rung in celebration changed their tone. At Hampton Court, black cloth was drawn across rooms. The fires continued to burn, but the palace was quieter. Servants moved with lowered eyes. The newborn prince slept in his nursery, while his mother lay dead nearby. His first days were surrounded by the sounds of mourning, the soft tread of attendants, the muted clink of funeral preparations, the deep bells travelling through cold air. Henry mourned Jane deeply. Of all his wives, she would later be remembered as the one he truly chose to join in death. When Henry himself died years later, he would be buried beside her. Jane had given him Edward, and in doing so she became fixed in his memory as the queen who had fulfilled the central demand of his life. Her funeral took place in November. Her coffin travelled from Hampton Court to Windsor, moving through the autumn landscape beneath grey skies. Horses walked slowly. Wheels creaked over wet roads. At Windsor Castle, she was buried in St. George's Chapel, where the stone walls held the echoes of royal ceremonies and ancient prayers. Mary, still only 21, served as chief mourner. The role placed her near the centre of the ceremony, a public recognition of her restored position in her father's household. She followed the coffin through the chapel, dressed in black, her face composed beneath the weight of old grief. She had lost her mother, seen her own status broken, watched Anne Boleyn rise and die, and now stood at the funeral of the woman who had helped restore her to favour. Elizabeth, too young for such a formal role, remained in the background of events. Yet the death of Jane left her once again without a maternal presence at court. The little princess had known a world of households and changing attendants, of adults who came and went, of a father whose visits were rare and whose moods were powerful. She'd been loved by some, ignored by others, and defined in law by a disgrace she could not understand. Edward grew beneath the vigilant care of his household. He was an infant prince, precious beyond measure. Nurses watched over his sleep. Physicians advised on his health. Every cough or fever would have caused alarm. The dynasty had one male child, and all England's hopes seemed to rest on his small body. Henry, however, was still a king in need of a wife. He had a son, but he remained vulnerable to the possibility that the boy might not survive. A second son would make the future safer. A queen could also bring a useful foreign alliance. The search for another marriage began, as it always did, with portraits, letters, diplomats, and careful consideration of bloodlines. The first serious possibility was Christina, Duchess of Milan, a young widow and niece of Emperor Charles V. When Henry's ambassador suggested marriage, Christina is said to have replied that if she had two heads, one might be at the King of England's disposal. The remark may have been polished by later retelling, but it captured a truth understood across Europe. Henry was a wealthy and powerful monarch, yet he was also the man whose second wife had been beheaded and whose third wife had died after giving birth. Foreign courts observed England with caution. Henry's ministers considered other candidates. There were discussions with France, with Scotland, and with the German states. Eventually, the king's attention turned towards Anne of Cleves. Anne was the daughter of the Duke of Cleves, a ruler in the northwest of the Holy Roman Empire. Her brother, William, controlled lands of strategic importance near the Netherlands. At a time when Henry feared a possible alliance between France and the Emperor against England, Cleves offered a useful connection. Anne was not known to Henry personally. He had never met her. Like many royal marriages, the match began not with affection but with maps, treaties, and the changing pressure of European politics. Hans Holbein, the court painter, was sent to paint Anne's portrait. Holbein created an image of a woman with a clear, composed face, pale skin, and a richly embroidered red gown. Henry liked what he saw. The portrait travelled to England, carrying with it the delicate promise that a painting can offer. It was a still, flattering vision, a future queen captured in colour and line, untouched by weather, unfamiliar language, or the nervous reality of first acquaintance. The marriage treaty was agreed. Anne left Cleves late in 1539. Her journey to England took her through winter landscapes and across the Channel. The sea was cold. The wind pressed against the sails. At each stopping place, there were new rooms, new servants, and new languages. She was 24 years old, travelling towards a king she had never met, in a country whose customs and speech were unfamiliar. Henry was impatient to see her. On New Year's Day, 1540, he travelled in disguise to Rochester, where Anne was staying. The disguise was part of a courtly game that Henry enjoyed. He expected, perhaps, that she would recognise him through instinct or affection, or that she would respond with delight to the sudden arrival of a gallant stranger. Anne did not know him. She had been told to expect the king formally. Instead, a large, ageing man in a mask entered her rooms and attempted to embrace and kiss her. She was startled. She turned away. She responded with the reserve that might be expected of a woman faced with an unknown man in a strange place. Henry was offended. When he later appeared in full royal splendour, Anne understood who he was. But the first impression had already settled in his mind. He complained that he found her unattractive. He said, with characteristic bluntness, that he liked her not. Later, cruel language would be used about her appearance, though much of it reflected Henry's disappointment and the hostile judgment of those around him, rather than any neutral truth. Anne had entered England with few friends and little power. She could not easily defend herself against the king's dislike. The marriage went forward anyway. On the 6th of January 1540, Henry and Anne were married at Greenwich Palace. The ceremony took place in winter, with firelight reflecting from the windows and wind moving through the palace courts. Anne wore the formal clothes of an English queen. Henry stood beside her, but his dissatisfaction was already visible to those who watched him closely. The marriage was never consummated, according to both Henry and Anne. He claimed that he could not fulfill it. She later stated that she remained a virgin. The court watched with silent anxiety. The new queen did not speak English well. She did not understand the king's jokes or the rapid, layered language of the court. She had been raised in a household less polished than Henry's, without the French education that had shaped Anne Boleyn. Her clothing and manners were criticised. She seemed plain to people who valued display. Yet Anne of Cleves was not foolish. She observed. She learned. Beneath the discomfort of her first months in England was a practical intelligence that would soon become important. Henry began to look elsewhere. His attention was caught by Catherine Howard, a young lady in Anne of Cleves's household. Catherine was a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, who had also been Anne Boleyn's uncle. The Howard family had lost influence after Anne's fall, but now they saw another opportunity. Catherine was young, lively, and beautiful in the bright, conventional manner that pleased Henry. Compared with Anne of Cleves, she seemed to him a return to youth. The king's desire altered the course of another woman's life. Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the Cleves marriage, found himself in danger. The alliance that had seemed useful only months earlier no longer suited Henry. Cromwell's enemies seized the moment. He was accused of heresy and treason, arrested at a council meeting and confined in the Tower. The fall was swift and chillingly familiar. Cromwell had helped make Henry supreme head of the English Church. He had organized the dissolution of the monasteries. He had helped destroy Anne Boleyn. He had directed the machinery of royal power with a skill few could equal. Yet none of it protected him when the king's will changed. He was executed on Tower Hill in July 1540. On the same day, Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled. Anne had a choice that was not truly a choice. She could resist, as Catherine of Aragon had done, and risk the wrath of a king whose marital history was known to all Europe. Or she could accept the annulment, acknowledge that the marriage had not been consummated, and allow Henry to free himself. Anne chose survival. She agreed to the annulment. In return, Henry treated her generously. She was given a substantial income, several residences, and the honourable title of the king's sister. She was placed after the Queen and the king's daughters in rank, becoming a respected member of the royal family rather than a discarded foreign bride. It was a remarkable outcome. Anne of Cleves remained in England for the rest of her life. She learned English, managed her estates, and occasionally visited court. She developed a cordial relationship with Henry, and later with his children. She outlived both Henry and Catherine Howard, and lived long enough to see the shifting world of Tudor rule continue without her at its centre. Her survival had depended upon understanding a truth that other queens had not been able or willing to accept. With Henry VIII, safety lay not in winning an argument, but in leaving before the argument became fatal. By the summer of 1540, the king had entered his fourth marriage and was already preparing for his fifth. Jane Seymour was dead, preserved in memory as the mother of his son. Anne of Cleves was alive, safely removed from the role of queen. Thomas Cromwell, once indispensable, was dead, and the young Catherine Howard stood near the throne, surrounded by the ambitions of her family. The palace lights glowed against the gathering evening. In corridors rich with tapestries and painted wood, servants carried fresh rushes, polished plate, and folded linen towards rooms prepared for another royal wedding. The sound of music began again in the distance, but beneath it, as always, there was the quieter sound of footsteps moving carefully through the halls. The summer of 1540 carried Henry VIII towards another marriage. The king was nearly 50 years old. His body had grown heavy, and the old wound in his leg caused him persistent pain. He no longer moved with the effortless grace of the young prince who had ridden beneath bright banners and shattered lances before cheering crowds. Now he was often carried in a chair or supported as he walked. His leg was dressed and cleaned by attendants. Its pain could make the air around him tense, for the king's temper was never far from the surface. Yet Henry still wanted to be admired. In the great chambers of his palaces, the old rituals continued. Candles gleamed upon silver plate. Fires warmed the carved oak walls. Musicians played beneath painted ceilings. The king wore velvet, fur, cloth of gold, and jewels heavy enough to catch the light with every movement. Courtiers bowed and smiled, adjusting their faces to the mood of the man before them. Catherine Howard entered this world as a young woman of perhaps 17, or perhaps even younger. Her exact birth year remains uncertain, but she was certainly young beside the aging king. She was a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, one of England's greatest noblemen, and a cousin of Anne Boleyn. The Howard family had seen one niece become queen and die on the scaffold. Now they watched another step into the same dangerous circle of royal attention. Catherine had been raised in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at Lambert. It was not a quiet, closely guarded upbringing. The household was large, busy, and loosely supervised. Young people slept in shared rooms, lessons were irregular, and servants came and went through corridors filled with chatter. At night, when the older household officers had withdrawn, doors opened softly and laughter travelled behind curtains. Catherine had formed attachments before she came to court. One was with Henry Mannix, a music teacher. Another, more serious and more difficult to deny, was with Francis Derham, a young man in the Duchess's household. The two had called each other husband and wife according to later testimony. They had spoken as though a marriage might one day take place. In Tudor law and custom, such words could matter. A promise of marriage, especially if joined with intimacy, might be treated as a pre-contract, an agreement that could make a later marriage invalid. At the time, Catherine was young, unprotected, and living in a household where adults did not always watch carefully. Yet years later, those private moments would be pulled into the light, examined by men with pens and legal authority, and turned into evidence of treason. For now, none of this was visible to Henry. He saw Catherine at court, where she served in the household of Anne of Cleves. Against the reserved German queen, Catherine seemed bright and fresh. She was pretty, lively, and dressed in the fashion of the day. Her youth flattered Henry. Her smiles appeared to restore something he had lost. In her company, he could imagine himself not as an ailing, suspicious king, but as the desired centre of a glittering court. Henry's attraction grew quickly. His marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled in July 1540. On the same day, Thomas Cromwell was executed. A few weeks later, on the 28th of July, Henry married Catherine Howard at Oatlands Palace in Surrey. The wedding was quiet, but the court understood its meaning. Catherine became queen. The Howards rose again. Her uncle Norfolk stood near the centre of power. Her relatives received positions. The palace filled with the sound of fresh celebration. New gowns rustling in galleries, musicians tuning their instruments, horses arriving with gifts, servants carrying wine through passageways scented with smoke and rosemary. Henry called Catherine his rose without a thorn. It was a dangerous phrase because it revealed how little he knew of her past and how completely he had turned her into an image. She was not simply a young woman. She had become the king's fantasy of innocence, beauty, and renewal. He gave her jewels, fine clothes, land, and attention. He delighted in watching her dance. The queen's chambers became lively with music, games, and young companions. Catherine tried to fulfill the role expected of her. She smiled beside Henry at public ceremonies. She accepted the elaborate clothes, the jewels, and the formal reverence of those who approached her. But beneath the brightness of court life lay a fragile and dangerous secret. Francis Derham had returned to her orbit. He arrived at court and was given a post in her household, perhaps at Catherine's own request, perhaps through the influence of others. The decision would later seem reckless, but for Catherine it may have been an attempt to control a person who knew too much. Derham had known her before she was queen. He knew the private language of her past, the promises made in a crowded household, the affection and intimacy that could now destroy her. Bringing him close might have seemed safer than leaving him beyond her reach. It was not safe. Another man also entered the Queen's story, Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was a gentleman of the King's privy chamber, close to Henry and trusted within the court. He was handsome, confident, and accustomed to moving through the private spaces around royal power. Catherine and Culpeper began to meet in secret, often with the help of Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Lady Rochford was the widow of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother. She had survived the destruction of the Boleyn family in 1536, though her own testimony against George and Anne had later made her name shadowed and controversial. Now she served Catherine Howard, arranging the small, concealed meetings that took place after dark. The details of Catherine and Culpeper's relationship remain uncertain. Their surviving letters suggest an emotional attachment, perhaps a physical one, though historians cannot say exactly how far it went. What matters is that the meetings were secret, and secrecy around a queen's body was never merely private. If Catherine had taken a lover, any child she bore might not be the king's. That possibility touched the heart of Tudor fear. The succession, the bloodline, the fragile certainty of inheritance. The meetings took place during the Royal Progress of 1541. A royal progress was a moving court, a kingdom in miniature travelling through its own lands. Henry, Catherine, councillors, guards, servants, musicians, and carts of household goods travelled north through England. The roads were muddy, wheels groaned, horses breathed steam into the cool air, towns prepared receptions, bells rang. Local gentlemen offered food, lodging, speeches, and displays of loyalty. The king intended the progress to show strength in the north, where rebellion and religious resistance had troubled his rule. He wanted to be seen, powerful, secure, surrounded by a young queen and a court that seemed united. But in the inns, castles, and borrowed houses along the route, another story unfolded. At night, when the public rooms had quietened and candles burned low, Catherine's ladies gathered in her chambers. Fabric brushed against the floors. The air carried perfume wax and the faint, damp scent of autumn cloaks. Lady Rochford helped arrange private encounters with Culpeper. A side door might open. A trusted servant might stand watch. The Queen and the gentleman met in rooms where every creak of wood, every distant footstep, every gust of wind against a shutter could have carried danger. Catherine was perhaps still a teenager. Culpeper was older and experienced. The Queen had little true freedom, yet she held immense ceremonial power. She was surrounded by people who hoped to benefit from her favour and by others who could ruin her if the secrets of her household became known. The progress ended. Winter approached. Then, far from the palace's scented rooms and guarded corridors, the past began to speak. A man named John Lascelles had a sister, Mary Hall, who had once lived in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household. Mary knew of Catherine's earlier relationships. Lascelles, a reformer who had connections at court, told Archbishop Cranmer that the Queen had not been chaste before marriage. Cranmer received the information cautiously. He was no longer simply a scholar involved in the king's great matter. He was Archbishop of Canterbury, a central figure in the New English Church. He understood how dangerous an accusation against a queen could be. If it was false, the accuser might suffer terribly. If it was true, the king's marriage and honour were at risk. Cranmer chose not to tell Henry directly in conversation. Instead, he wrote a letter and placed it where the king would find it after attending Mass on All Saints' Day, the 1st of November 1541. The letter waited in the quiet of the royal chapel. Outside, the season was turning. The light faded early. Bare branches moved against the sky. In the chapel, candles flickered before the altar, and the familiar words of worship rose into the air. Henry knelt as king, husband, and supreme head of the church he had created. Then he found the letter. The accusation did not initially convince him. Henry was shocked, perhaps angry, perhaps unwilling to believe that the young queen he adored could have deceived him. He ordered a secret investigation. The court was not told. Catherine continued her daily routine, unaware that officials were beginning to question people connected to her past. Servants were summoned. Old acquaintances were examined. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household was searched through memory. Francis Derham was questioned. At first, he admitted a previous relationship with Catherine, but denied that she had been unfaithful after becoming queen. He claimed, however, that Catherine had been pre-contracted to him. If true, this was already enough to threaten her marriage to Henry. Then the investigators found evidence of Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was arrested. Under questioning, he admitted meeting Catherine privately. He insisted that they had not consummated an affair, but he also acknowledged that he had intended to do so. Catherine's letters to him, with their anxious expressions of longing and secrecy, gave the investigators what they needed to build a case. The walls around the Queen began to close. Catherine was told of the accusations while staying at Hampton Court. The palace, with its red brick towers, great gates and long galleries, had known joy and mourning in equal measure. Jane Seymour had given birth to Edward there and died nearby. Anne Boleyn had once walked its rooms as queen. Now Catherine Howard heard that her past had been uncovered. She was said to have reacted with horror and disbelief. She asked to see the king. She wanted to explain herself. She wanted to plead for mercy. But Henry refused to see her. She was taken from her chambers, and her household was broken apart. The story later grew around one particular image: Catherine escaping her guards and running through Hampton Court's galleries, crying out for Henry as he attended prayers in the chapel. Whether every detail happened exactly as later memory tells, it cannot be proven. But the image has endured because it contains the essence of her situation. A young queen in terror, running through familiar rooms trying to reach the one man who could save her, while the heavy doors of power remained closed. Even now, the long gallery at Hampton Court carries a strange quiet. Light falls through tall windows. Footsteps travel along the floor. A visitor can imagine the sound of hurried skirts, a breathless cry, hands striking against a locked door. Whether history or legend, the echo belongs to Catherine. She was taken first to Sion Abbey, a former religious house beside the Thames. The old monastic buildings had been altered after the dissolution, but their atmosphere remained austere. Stone passages held the cold. The river moved nearby beneath the winter sky. Catherine was separated from the glittering court that had once seemed to belong to her. Her ladies were questioned. Her jewels were removed. Her clothes were reduced from the elaborate display of queenship to the necessities permitted to a prisoner. The legal process unfolded with the implacable rhythm of Tudor government. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were tried for treason in December 1541. Derham's earlier relationship with Catherine became part of the case, but Culpeper's secret meetings with the Queen made the accusation more immediate. Both men were found guilty. Culpeper was beheaded at Tyburn. Derham suffered the harsher penalty reserved for traitors: hanging, drawing, and quartering. The crowd gathered in the winter cold. Carts rolled through muddy streets. The public spectacle reminded London that the king's honour and the safety of the succession were matters for which men could die. Their heads were placed upon London Bridge. Travellers approaching the city saw them above the river, dark shapes against the grey sky. The water below continued to carry barges, refuse, fragments of everyday life. Above it, the exposed heads served as a warning. The intimate secret of a queen had become the property of the state. Catherine's fate remained unresolved for a time. Parliament passed a bill of attainder declaring her guilty without the need for a conventional trial. The law now made it treason for a queen to conceal sexual misconduct before marriage or to encourage others to do so. It was a law shaped around Catherine's circumstances, a grim response to a king who felt betrayed not only in private, but before all Europe. Lady Rochford was also condemned. Her involvement in arranging the meetings with Culpeper placed her in the same fatal path. By this point, she was said to be mentally unwell, distressed and unstable under the strain of imprisonment and interrogation. Ordinarily, a person judged insane could not be executed, but the law was changed to allow her death. In February 1542, Catherine was brought to the Tower of London. The river journey was cold. The water lapped against the sides of the barge. The towers rose slowly ahead, as they had for Anne Boleyn 6 years earlier. Catherine entered through the Traitor's Gate, passing beneath the dark stone arch, into the fortress where another of Henry's queens had waited for death. She was held in rooms within the tower, perhaps aware of Anne's fate, perhaps too frightened to think beyond the next hour. She had been queen for little more than a year. The jewels, music, dancing, and favour of the king had vanished. What remained were guards, prayers, locked doors, and the close stillness of winter. On the night before her execution, Catherine asked to see the block. It was brought to her room so that she could practice placing her head upon it. The detail is difficult to hear across the centuries. It reveals the practical terror beneath all the ceremonial language of execution. A girl, barely beyond childhood, had to prepare her body for the exact shape of her death. The next morning, the 13th of February 1542, was cold and grey. Catherine walked to the scaffold within the tower grounds. The grass was damp. A small group of witnesses gathered. The city beyond the walls went on with its winter morning. Carts on the streets, smoke rising from chimneys, market traders arranging their goods. Within the tower, time narrowed around the scaffold. Catherine addressed those present. The exact words later attributed to her are uncertain, but she spoke of dying a queen and asked for prayers. She acknowledged the king's judgment. Then she knelt and placed her head upon the block. The axe fell. Lady Rochford was executed after her. Their bodies were buried near Anne Boleyn's in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Beneath its stone floor, 3 women connected by court, family, ambition and fear lay close together. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard and Lady Rochford. Henry received the news of Catherine's death. He did not marry again immediately. The loss of Catherine had been different from the loss of Anne. Anne's fall had been a political solution, the removal of a queen who had failed to give him the son he wanted. Catherine's death was more intimate in its humiliation. She had been his young bride, the rose without a thorn, and her betrayal cut into the image he had created for himself. The king became increasingly heavy, ill, and isolated. His leg continued to trouble him. The smell of medicines and dressings sometimes followed him through the palace. His moods darkened. The people around him understood the importance of obedience, but no obedience could entirely relieve the loneliness of a man who had destroyed so many of the people closest to him. In 1543, Henry married for the 6th and final time. His new wife was Catherine Parr, a widow twice over, educated, devout, and more than 30 years old. She was not chosen for youthful beauty or the promise of many children. Henry had Edward, his longed-for son. Catherine Parr offered something else: companionship, intelligence, and the ability to manage a fractured royal household. She arrived at court with a steady presence. Catherine Parr was learned in languages and theology. She read religious books, wrote prayers, and took an interest in the education of Henry's children. She understood the dangers of the court, but she also understood the king's need to feel respected. She spoke to him with care, allowing him to appear wise and authoritative even when she held views of her own. At Hampton Court and Whitehall, the sounds of family life returned in a gentler form. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward were brought together more often. The 3 children, each marked by the tragedies of their mothers, were now gathered beneath the protection of a stepmother who saw their value. Catherine Parr encouraged Henry to restore Mary and Elizabeth to the succession, though not to legitimacy. In 1544, the Third Succession Act placed them after Edward in the line of inheritance. It was a cautious repair of the family Henry had broken. The law did not erase old wounds. Mary and Elizabeth remained technically illegitimate, but it acknowledged that they might one day rule England. The children studied, prayed, and learned the difficult art of existing near their father. Edward was educated as a Protestant prince, surrounded by scholars who imagined a reformed future for England. Mary remained devoted to the Catholic faith of her mother. Elizabeth absorbed languages, history, rhetoric, and the habits of careful observation. In the royal nurseries and schoolrooms, books opened beneath candlelight. Tutors' voices moved steadily through Latin grammar and scripture. Outside, the weather changed across the palace gardens, indifferent to the anxieties contained within. Catherine Parr's intelligence eventually made her vulnerable. She held reforming religious views and spoke openly with women who shared them. In 1546, conservative enemies at court persuaded Henry that she had gone too far. A warrant for her arrest was prepared. For a moment, she stood near the same precipice that had claimed other queens. But Catherine understood the nature of survival. When Henry confronted her about theology, she answered with humility. She said she had discussed religion only to learn from his greater wisdom. She presented herself not as a teacher or opponent, but as an obedient wife seeking the king's instruction. Henry, flattered and reassured, accepted her explanation. When officers arrived to arrest her the next day, The king rebuked them and sent them away. Catherine Parr had escaped. She remained beside Henry as his health failed. By the final years of his life, he was a deeply altered man. The king who had once towered over the court in athletic splendor now required help to move. His leg wounds worsened. His appetite, his pain, and his temper became subjects of anxious attention. The palaces still held music and ceremony, but a sense of ending entered their rooms. At Whitehall in January 1547, winter pressed against the windows. Fires flickered in the royal chambers. The Thames moved black and cold beyond the palace. Henry lay ill, attended by servants, counsellors, and physicians who spoke in low voices. He was 55 years old. On the 28th of January, Henry VIII died. The news travelled through the palace with the solemn movement of a bell. Doors opened quietly. Messengers were sent. Courtiers gathered in black. The king who had transformed England through desire, fear, faith, and violence was gone. His 9-year-old son Edward became king. The child had inherited a crown made heavy by the choices of his father. He inherited a kingdom separated from Rome, a court divided by religion and ambition, and a family assembled from the remnants of 6 marriages. Outside the palace, the winter rain continued to fall upon the streets of London. It touched the roofs, the river, the old stone walls of the tower, and the chapel floor beneath which Henry's queens lay in silence. The new king was a boy, and around him the adults began to move. Edward VI was 9 years old when he became King of England. On a cold January morning in 1547, the palace at Whitehall was full of subdued movement. Winter light pressed faintly against the windows. Fires burned low in the chambers where Henry VIII had died. Servants walked quietly across floors scattered with rushes. Doors opened and closed with care. The sound of the Thames moved beyond the palace walls, dark water passing beneath a grey sky. The boy who inherited the crown was slight, serious, and carefully educated. He had pale hair, a narrow face, and the composed manner of a child who had long been told that his life belonged to the kingdom. He had been raised as the longed-for son of Henry VIII, the child whose birth had cost Jane Seymour her life. From infancy, he had been guarded by nurses, tutors, physicians, and officers of his household. His health, his lessons, his prayers, and even the smallest details of his daily routine had been watched with anxious attention. Now he was king, but Edward was too young to rule alone. Before Henry VIII died, he had appointed a council to govern during Edward's minority. Yet within days, Edward's maternal uncle, Edward Seymour, took control. He became Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of the realm. Somerset was ambitious, intelligent, and convinced that he understood what England needed. He also understood that the boy king's crown could make an adult man immensely powerful. The court rearranged itself around the young king. Men who had served Henry VIII measured their futures again. They moved through candlelit chambers with documents tucked beneath their arms. They held long meetings behind closed doors. The old king's will was read and interpreted. Titles were granted, offices changed hands. Outside, London continued with its winter business. Barges rocking on the river, black smoke rising from chimneys, bells calling the faithful to prayer. Edward, meanwhile, continued his studies. He read scripture, history, languages, and theology. His tutors shaped him into a committed Protestant. The religious changes begun under his father deepened during his reign. Latin services were replaced by English prayers. Images were removed from churches, altars changed. The old rhythms of Catholic worship, familiar to generations of English people, began to fade from parish life. In country churches, the changes could be heard as much as seen. The familiar Latin words fell quiet. The smell of incense became less common. Painted statues disappeared from niches. Whitewashed walls covered old colours. Parishioners stood in pews listening to a New English service, while wind pressed against the church doors and rain moved softly over the churchyard grass. To Edward, these changes were not merely political. He believed in them. His diary, kept with grave diligence, reveals a boy who took religion seriously. He saw Protestant reform as a sacred duty. Yet the kingdom he ruled was larger and more complicated than the books in his schoolroom. In 1549, unrest spread across England. There were rebellions in Devon and Cornwall, where people resisted the new prayer book and the loss of traditional worship. In Norfolk, another rising, led by Robert Kett, drew together men angry about enclosure, poverty, and the power of local landowners. Fields, hedges, rents, religion and hunger all became tangled together. The sound of rebellion travelled along country roads, boots in mud, voices raised beneath rain-dark skies, the clatter of tools carried as weapons. At Norwich, Kett's followers camped on Mousehold Heath. Fires burned at night across the hillside. Below them, the city lay in shadow, its church towers rising above the roofs. Somerset's government struggled to restore order. Armies moved through the country. Horses carried armed men over fields wet with autumn rain. Cannon smoke drifted across open ground. The rebellions were defeated, but the violence left its mark. England was changing, and not everyone wished to be carried along with it. Somerset's power weakened. His enemies at court, led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, watched for their moment. In 1549, Somerset was removed from office. The shift happened with the quiet swiftness familiar to Tudor politics. One day, a man stood near the centre of government. Soon afterwards, guards stood at his door. Somerset was imprisoned, released, and then later accused of conspiracy. In 1552, he was executed. The young king had watched another uncle rise and fall. John Dudley became the dominant figure in Edward's government. He was clever, disciplined, and less inclined than Somerset towards uncertain idealism. He sought stability, but he also sought power for his own family. Under his influence, Protestant reforms continued. The Book of Common Prayer was revised. Laws against Catholic worship were strengthened. The young king's court became increasingly Protestant in tone, with preachers, scholars, and counsellors imagining a kingdom firmly separated from the religion of Mary, Edward's elder half-sister. Mary watched these developments with deep unease. She was Henry VIII's eldest surviving child, now a woman in her 30s. She had endured the rejection of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and years in which her own legitimacy had been denied. She remained devoted to the Catholic faith. In the chapels of her household, Mass continued to be celebrated. Candles burned before the altar. Priests wore the old vestments. The familiar prayers, forbidden or altered elsewhere, still rose in Latin beneath the old stone roofs. Edward disapproved. The brother and sister exchanged letters in which duty, faith, and family affection were woven into difficult knots. Edward urged Mary to accept the new religion. Mary insisted that her conscience could not obey. Their dispute was not merely theological. It was shaped by all that had happened to their mother and father. To Mary, obedience to the old faith was bound to Catherine's memory, to her own identity, and to the truth for which she had suffered. The royal family remained outwardly connected, yet its members lived in separate worlds. Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth had been brought together under Catherine Parr's care in the last years of Henry VIII's life. They had studied, dined, and appeared at court as a family repaired by necessity. But Henry's death loosened that fragile arrangement. Catherine Parr married quickly after the king's death. Her new husband was Thomas Seymour, brother of the Lord Protector and uncle to Edward VI. Thomas was handsome, ambitious, and restless. He had once hoped to marry the young Princess Elizabeth, who was then 13 years old. Instead, he married Catherine Parr, the king's widow, though he continued to show an unsettling interest in Elizabeth. Elizabeth went to live in Catherine Parr's household at Chelsea. She was an intelligent girl with red hair, watchful eyes, and a gift for languages. Her tutors had taught her Latin, Greek, French, Italian, rhetoric, and scripture. She had learned to write with clarity and elegance. But the household at Chelsea became a place of confusion and danger. Thomas Seymour played games with Elizabeth that crossed boundaries. He entered her bedchamber in the mornings. He tickled her, slapped her playfully, and behaved with an intimacy that worried the servants around them. Catherine Parr initially seemed to treat the behaviour as foolish sport. On one occasion, she joined in. But the mood changed when she appeared to find Thomas and Elizabeth together in a compromising embrace. Elizabeth was sent away. The sound of carriage wheels leaving Chelsea would have carried her from a house that had once promised safety. She was still young, yet she had already learned something essential about the world around her. The intentions of powerful men could be concealed beneath laughter, and a girl's reputation could be damaged by circumstances she did not fully control. Catherine Parr died in childbirth in 1548. Her infant daughter, Mary Seymour, survived only briefly in the records before disappearing into silence. Thomas Seymour's ambitions became more reckless. He tried to gain control over Edward, to marry Elizabeth, and to position himself at the centre of government. He was arrested and executed for treason in 1549. Elizabeth was questioned about her relationship with him. She answered with remarkable caution. She did not confess to any plot. She did not accuse herself. She did not offer more information than she had to. In letters and interrogations, the teenage princess displayed the composure that would later become one of her greatest strengths. She understood that words, once spoken, could travel far beyond the room in which they were said. While Elizabeth learned to survive, Edward grew ill. In the early months of 1553, it became clear that the king's health was failing. He had always been delicate, but now he developed a persistent cough and wasting sickness. Some later writers suggested tuberculosis. Others have wondered about different illnesses. The certainty of diagnosis has been lost, but the picture remains. A 15-year-old king growing thinner, weaker, and more aware that he might not live. In the rooms where he lay ill, the air would have carried the smells of medicine, herbs, wax, and damp linen. Physicians came and went. Courtiers stood at a distance, speaking softly. Windows were opened or closed according to the weather and the advice of those attending him. Outside, summer approached, and the gardens continued their slow green growth. Edward had one great fear. If he died under the succession established by his father, Mary would become queen. After Mary came Elizabeth. Both sisters were formally illegitimate. though they had been restored to the line of succession. Mary was Catholic. Elizabeth's religious beliefs were less certain, but she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose marriage had divided England. To Edward and the Protestant men around him, the prospect of Mary's accession threatened to undo everything they had built. John Dudley, now Duke of Northumberland, helped guide the king towards another solution. Edward drew up a document known as the Devise for the Succession. It passed over Mary and Elizabeth and named Lady Jane Grey as his heir. Jane was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's youngest sister, Mary Tudor. She was a committed Protestant, highly educated, and married to Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley. Jane was only 15 or 16. She had spent much of her youth with books. She could read Greek and Latin. She loved religious learning. She was serious, slight, and, by most accounts, uncomfortable with the role that was about to be forced upon her. Her marriage to Guildford Dudley in May 1553 had been part of a larger plan, though its full meaning may not have been clear to her at first. On the 6th of July, Edward VI died at Greenwich Palace. The death was kept secret for several days. In the palace, the doors were guarded. Messengers rode out under cover of night. Councillors gathered in quiet rooms, their faces lit by candles. The boy king's body lay still, while men decided what would happen to the crown. On the 10th of July, Lady Jane Grey was brought to the Tower of London. Traditionally, a monarch went to the Tower before a coronation. But Jane's arrival had none of the easy triumph that had accompanied earlier royal entries. The barge carried her down. The Thames, the river's surface shifted beneath a summer sky. The Tower rose ahead, dark and familiar. Jane was told that she was queen. She wept. The crown was brought to her, and she accepted it only after protest. It was placed before her in the Tower, a heavy object of gold, jewels, memory, and danger. Her husband, Guildford, expected to be made king, but Jane refused him that title. This small resistance created bitterness within a marriage that had scarcely begun. For 9 days, Lady Jane Grey was Queen of England. At first, Northumberland believed his plan would succeed. The council proclaimed Jane. Official notices were sent out. The machinery of government began to move in her name. But Mary had not remained passive. She had been warned of Edward's death and escaped to East Anglia. There she gathered supporters. Her claim was stronger in the eyes of many English people. She was Henry VIII's daughter. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She had suffered under her father's later marriages and remained, to many, the rightful heir. In the towns and countryside, support for Mary grew. Landowners, soldiers, and ordinary people joined her. The sound of riders on roads, the gathering of armed men, and the ringing of bells marked her advance. Mary's banners moved through the summer landscape. Her supporters shouted her name. Northumberland marched out from London to stop her, but his confidence began to dissolve. The council in London turned against him. On the 19th of July, Jane's brief reign ended. Mary was proclaimed queen. The bells of London rang again, this time for Mary. Jane was left in the Tower, not as a queen awaiting coronation, but as a prisoner. The change was brutal in its simplicity. The rooms remained, the stone walls remained. The river continued beneath the windows. But the guards now watched her for a different reason. Northumberland was executed within weeks. Jane's father was pardoned for a time. Jane and Guildford remained imprisoned. Mary did not immediately order their deaths. Perhaps she saw Jane as a pawn rather than a true rival. Perhaps she hoped that mercy would make her own accession seem generous. For a while, Jane lived in the tower with books and prayer. She wrote letters. She read scripture. She corresponded with those who urged her to return to Catholicism, and she refused. Her faith, like Edward's, was serious and deeply held. The young woman who had not wanted a crown now had only her beliefs to hold against the narrowing world around her. Mary entered London in triumph. She was 37 years old, unmarried, and at last queen after a life shaped by loss. The city greeted her with crowds and banners. Church bells rang from tower to tower. The streets filled with people eager to see the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She rode through London with Elizabeth beside her, an image of family unity after years of division. Mary's early reign was filled with relief for those who loved the old religion. Mass returned. Altars were restored. Priests put on vestments that had been set aside. Candles returned to churches. The smell of incense once again rose beneath ancient roofs. For Mary, this was not simply a reversal of policy. It was a restoration of truth, a return to the faith of her mother and the world that had been taken from her. But the restoration was not gentle for everyone. Mary's decision to marry Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V, stirred deep anxiety. England had long feared foreign influence. Many people worried that a Spanish husband would dominate the kingdom. Others, Protestant and Catholic alike, disliked the idea of England being drawn into Habsburg wars. In 1554, a rebellion led by Sir Thomas Wyatt rose in Kent. The rebels marched towards London through cold February weather. The roads were wet. The river wind cut through cloaks. Rumours moved quickly. The rebels were near. The city might fall. Elizabeth was involved. Elizabeth was not proven to have taken part, but suspicion fell upon her. She was brought to the Tower of London, travelling by barge through rain and rough water. She was 20 years old. The same fortress that had held her mother, Anne Boleyn, now opened its gates to receive her. The officers urged her to enter through the Traitors' Gate, but Elizabeth resisted, knowing its terrible associations. Eventually she stepped ashore, her shoes wet, and walked beneath the stone arch. For weeks she was questioned. She denied involvement in Wyatt's rebellion. She wrote careful letters to Mary, protesting loyalty and innocence. In the tower, the air would have been cold, the stone walls damp, and the sounds of the river endlessly close. At night, bells from the city reached her faintly. She knew that her mother had entered the tower and never left it alive. Elizabeth was eventually released, but not freed. She was sent to Woodstock, where she lived under guard. The house was quieter than the tower, but uncertainty followed her. Every rider arriving at the gate, every sealed letter, every unexpected summons carried the possibility of danger. She learned patience. She learned to wait. She learned to let others speak first. Mary married Philip in July 1554. Their wedding took place at Winchester Cathedral, beneath the old stone arches and solemn music of the church. Mary was deeply devoted to her husband, though Philip found England unfamiliar and his marriage politically necessary rather than affectionate. He was younger than Mary, reserved and often absent. The hoped-for union of love, dynasty, and Catholic restoration did not bring Mary the security she wanted. She believed herself pregnant in 1555. The court prepared, rooms were made ready, the bells were held in expectation. Mary's body changed, and she withdrew from public view. People waited for the birth of a Catholic heir, a child who would secure the restored faith and quiet the anxieties of the realm. But no child came. The pregnancy was false, perhaps a phantom pregnancy, perhaps caused by illness. The disappointment was profound. In the palace, the rooms prepared for a baby remained unused. The silence after expectation had its own sharpness. Mary, who had longed for a family of her own, was left with an emptiness that reached beyond politics. Her reign grew harsher. From 1555, Protestant heretics were burned at the stake. Nearly 300 people, men and women alike, died in this way. The burnings took place in towns and cities across England. Smoke rose above crowds gathered in churchyards and marketplaces. The crackle of fire, the tolling of bells, and the prayers of the condemned became part of the soundscape of Mary's reign. Mary believed she was saving souls from damnation. To her, heresy was not a private difference of opinion, but a danger to eternal life. Yet the burnings created fear and bitterness. The deaths of Bishops Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer at Oxford became especially powerful symbols for Protestants. Cranmer, who had helped Henry VIII end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, had once declared Mary illegitimate and supported the religious reforms she now reversed. Under pressure, he recanted his Protestant beliefs, but at the last moment, facing the flames, he withdrew his recantation and placed the hand that had signed it into the fire first. The smoke rose over Oxford. The old university city, with its towers and narrow streets, held the memory of that fire for generations. Mary's health declined. Another apparent pregnancy in 1557 ended without a child. Philip spent long periods abroad. The Queen grew increasingly ill, burdened by disappointment, grief, and the knowledge that Elizabeth remained her heir. In November 1558, Mary lay dying at St. James's Palace. The autumn days were short. Rain touched the windows. Fires flickered in rooms where the Queen had once waited for news of a child. Her attendants moved quietly. The sound of prayer filled the dim spaces around her bed. Mary died on the 17th of November, aged 42. On the same day, Elizabeth became Queen. At Hatfield House, Elizabeth received the news beneath an old oak tree, according to later tradition. She was 25 years old. The girl who had entered the tower beneath rain and suspicion was now the ruler of England. The crown had passed through a sickly boy, a reluctant teenage queen, and a grieving daughter of Catherine of Aragon. It now came to Anne Boleyn's daughter. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare branches. Somewhere bells began to ring.